You're listening to One Decision, the podcast that looks at the choices made that shape our world. I'm your host, Julia Macfarlane.
And I'm Richard Dearlove, former Chief of British Intelligence, otherwise known as MI6.
Together, Sir Richard and I speak to the key decision makers, the power players, and the influencers who shape some of the biggest events that impact us all. And today we're launching the first episode in a special series looking into the state of British politics and examining what could be the end of the Conservative Party's leadership after 14 years in power. Let's go back to autumn 2022, when British politics was up in smoke. After the government announced a bonanza of unprecedented tax cuts and spending, the markets panicked. The central bank undertook an extraordinary intervention to keep the economy stable, spending tens of billions of dollars buying government bonds. The then Prime Minister Liz Truss was out after 45 days in office, the shortest-serving PM in British history. Today, we're talking to her Chancellor at the centre of the storm. A Kennedy Scholar at Harvard, a King's Scholar at Eton, prolific author, academic and the son of Ghanaian immigrants, Kwasi Kwarteng was once seen as a rising star in the Tory party. But his chaotic mini-budget now lives in infamy, seen by many as one of the most disastrous political miscalculations in recent years. But was it all his fault? How does he feel about it a year and a half later? And how does Britain's first black Chancellor feel about the recent arguments about race in the Conservative Party? We sat down for a fascinating and frank conversation with Kwasi Kwarteng. You became an MP in 2010, what feels like eons ago. What would you say are the biggest changes that you've observed in politics since you made your maiden speech in the House of Commons all those years ago?
Yes, I think 2010 does feel like a very long time ago. And in some people's lives, 14 years goes in an instant. But I think in our political life, it's been a very, very long time. And my own view about this is that because of social media, because of the 24/7 culture, a year in politics feels like an eternity. So 14 years is a very long time. And in that time, I think we've seen huge changes. I mean, not only with Brexit, which has been a monumental thing in itself, and will be debated for many years, I have no doubt. I think the position of MPs, their accessibility, the fact that there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of rage. I think MPs are more exposed. I think they're more vulnerable. I think the whole social media world makes public life, representatives' lives more challenging. And I also think there's much higher expectation from the point of view of the electorate and constituents. And that's a good thing. But it does mean that I think MPs are under quite a lot of pressure these days.
Is that perhaps why you are not running again as an MP?
I mean, I'd probably do it all over again. It has been a hugely enjoyable and fascinating experience. But I think the MP shelf life these days is much shorter because of all those pressures than would have been the case maybe 40 years ago. I mean, I was in the House with people like Kenneth Clarke, and he was an MP for 49 years. And I think that the tempo, the pace at which political life is conducted now means that it's a lot less likely that people are going to be around for 40 years than was the case in the past. And I think just the pace, the scale of the MP's engagement with constituents, I think is much greater than was the case 20 or 30 years ago.
Kwasi, you've given some very reflective and open conversations since your time leaving office, since your time as Chancellor. Talk to us about that mini budget. How much of that budget was yours to shape, and how much of it did you have to negotiate with Liz Truss? I mean, how aligned were the two of you?
I think the main point one has to remember, and I've said this many times, it really starts with the leadership contest that summer. And people say, well, you were Chancellor of the Exchequer, you were in charge. But the whole premise of the leadership contest was about the economic question. That was what she spoke about at length. And it was clear to me that, her pitch to the members was we can't keep doing the same thing as far as the economy is concerned. That was pretty much her central message. And I think what happened was, having won pretty decisively the leadership campaign, and people said it would be more, but it was pretty decisive. I think that was the moment when we should have really slowed everything down. But I think we went the other way. I think we, having won the euphoria of winning, there was a slightly kind of surreal period, which she talks about in her book, when Her Majesty, the Queen, sadly passed away. And that created a kind of very odd vacuum, if you like.
The Queen told her to pace herself, apparently.
Well, yes, and actually Liz admitted that that was the right advice. But of course, hindsight is a beautiful thing. And we pushed ahead. And we all made mistakes, and we've got to be honest about that. And of course, and I think also that the environment was difficult as well. But one of the things that I feel bad about, among other things, was that, having gone in, I think the whole thing, she capitulated very quickly. And that was my own personal story. So I came back and I was sacked essentially on Twitter as a kind of Trumpian.
Yes, because you were at an IMF meeting in
That's
Washington.
Right. I was called back a day earlier. So I was due back, I think, on the Saturday morning. And I came back on the Friday morning. And I was driven to Downing Street. And I was essentially sacked. But on the way to Downing Street, I could see on Twitter, I think it was Steve Swinford of the Times, had said, the Chancellor, I can't remember which tense it was, whether it was will be or has been, but I just remember the Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, sacked, and was sacked or has been sacked, or I don't know what tense it was, but the message was clear. And I remember my special advisor was in the car with me and said, "Oh, do you think this is true?" And I said, "If it's Steve Swinford, it's definitely true." I mean, everything I don't know whether that's the case now, whether he's the go-to man now, but his Twitter was very reliable back in the day.
How was that meeting? Did you feel like there was still an opportunity for you to argue for your job?
No, I thought it was definitive. But I was surprised because it was obvious to me that once I'd been sacked, it was over for her. I was sort of slightly incredulous. I was thinking to myself, you have just destroyed your Premiership. There's no coming back. And I think I said to her, or maybe a spat afterwards, that she had about 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And that was reported actually in the Sunday Times. After the Friday I was sacked, it said, Kwarteng says PM has 3 weeks, or a headline to that effect. And of course I was wrong, it was 6 days. And I was sacked on the 14th of October, one remembers these dates. And then on the 20th of October, she announced that she was going to resign. And then the Prime Minister, our current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, took office, I think, on the 25th of October. So things happened very quickly.
Were you essentially asked to fall on your sword at that point?
No, I was sacked. I mean, we can be very British about things. I was sacked.
And you made that very clear in your resignation letter, which is interesting.
Well, it was actually, if you look at the Steve Swinford tweet from about 11:30 that morning, he uses that word.
One of the things that I find really extraordinary is that you have the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is an unelected body, telling you've got things wrong. Now, it's not a political body. It was created, I think, with perhaps a subtext. And I think, someone like me, who's quite sort of radical in my view of democracy, finds it quite objectionable that a body like that can turn round and just create chaos.
And they have huge power. And that's one of the things
Or provide a check.
Yes, I mean, that's one of the things.
Okay, the idea is that it should be a check. Right. But on the other hand, it's a check based on one interpretation of the economy.
Right. And also the thing is that, and this is the point that I think Liz was trying to make in her book and other people have made, and I think it's a fair one. A lot of these bodies have huge power.
Yeah.
And of course, they've got no accountability. I mean, I don't think one viewer, listener in 100 knows who is running the OBR. And even if they know the person who's on the top, they certainly don't know the people in the organisation. And over the last, I'm 48 now, so I've been following politics probably for 30 years in my adult life. And I think over the last 30 years, we've seen a huge proliferation of these quangos. And they wield enormous power. And it is a question, I think, about, when you're in an open democracy, as to how much influence and power these organisations should have.
That's something Liz Truss has been speaking about recently, and she has been very critical of the role of the Governor of the Bank of England and the Monetary Policy Committee, and making that point that they are unelected, they're not accountable. I mean, would you advocate for a change to that kind of system? Should the government have more of a role in the Monetary Policy Committee and in the OBR? I mean, what do you think? Is there a problem here that needs to be fixed?
I think it's quite tricky because once you've essentially created these bodies, and you'll understand this from your days in government, it's very difficult to kind of put the bureaucracy back into its box. I think there are ways you have to work with the bureaucracy. And that's how you've got to try and navigate change. But I think where I differ from Liz Truss is that just saying they should be abolished doesn't make any sense because, well, it does, but how are you going to do this? You've got to think of the means and the process. You can't just wish them away, and you've got to work with them. And I think that's one of the things probably we got wrong when I was in government. You can't just circumvent them. You've got to try and play ball with them.
Is there a world in which the mini budget could have succeeded? Is it if there had been more communication with the OBER before the publication of the report? What would have happened if the Bank of England had not intervened in the aftermath?
So I think, like everything in life, I think that the problem was the pace at which we tried to do things. The Prime Minister, as was Liz Truss, I think went to Balmoral on the 6th of September. I think it was the Tuesday. She won the Conservative leadership on the Monday, the 5th. She flew up to Scotland on the 6th. Her Majesty the Queen passed away on the 8th. That was the Thursday. And we had all the obsequies, the accession council, the funeral, all of those things happened within about 2 weeks. And then the mini budget, so-called, itself landed on the 23rd. Okay, so that's less than 3 weeks between the conclusion of the Conservative Party leadership contest and the mini budget. And then we had to deal with all of that ceremonial circumstance around the sad passing of Her Majesty. And I think that was the problem, not the fact that we had to deal with this sad event. But I think, in light of that, there was just too much. There was too much pace.
But a lot of people now are saying that the policy was right, the implementation was wrong. I mean, it was interesting because it doesn't seem to me now that the policy is as controversial as it was at the time.
So I think where the Prime Minister and I were agreed, and I think we were right, was to identify economic growth as the single biggest problem facing this country. Because without economic growth, we can't essentially pay for the welfare state that we have. And if we can't pay for the welfare state that we have, then you've got all sorts of social problems relating to everything, relating to immigration, relating to housing, relating to the welfare state, if you can't get economic growth. And I think it's interesting when you listen to Rachel Reeves, she talks about economic growth as well. She might have a different way of doing it, but the central question, exam question, if you want to put it that way, still remains and has essentially been unanswered. And I think as time passes, more and more people will be thinking, it was a lousy implementation, they got things wrong, they tried to do too much too quickly. But actually the fundamental problem that they were trying to solve is the thing we should be trying to, address. And I think as time passes, you've got a growth level of 0.5%, 1%. Your public sector is probably growing at maybe 5% a year. It becomes a more critical question. How are you going to grow the economy to pay for all the services that you want to provide the people?
Something that has really struck me about all of this is you personally, you've Eton scholar, double Kennedy scholar at Harvard, double first at Cambridge, a really incredible academic background. I think it was the Economist, and their profile of you when you became Chancellor said you were probably the most intelligent Chancellor we've had since Gordon Brown.
Best educated or something.
Something like that. You were in the best possible place to be a successful Chancellor. And to be seen as successful, and you have just one chance to get it right. And is there an issue that we have here in the way politics works, that you can be as qualified as you like, you can be as academic and intelligent as you like, but you will never be prepared for getting your hands on the levers of a multi-trillion dollar economy? There is no apprenticeship for this kind of thing, and it's almost trial and error. And is that just a mad way of doing things?
No, look, I think people should distinguish a couple of things. Education, knowledge, experience even. In my view, having seen lots of prime ministers, I think all of that is secondary to temperament. Because the thing about politics, it's not like revising for an exam and then you go to the exam room and everything is still and you've got precisely 3 hours to answer the question. Actual politics isn't like that at all. Actual politics, the thing's flying around all the time. There's people saying things, there's panic, there's all sorts of human emotions involved. And I think the best leaders, and as you know, I'm a historian as well, but I've thought a lot about my experience, and I've read a bit about other people's experience. I think the best leaders are people who have the right temperament. They're cool and considered, and they don't panic when things go badly. And I think that was the element that one really needs, and we need it. And I think you have to have a much more kind of steady approach. And I was reading about people like Dwight Eisenhower. He wasn't the most intellectual. He probably wasn't the most on top of things in the sense of being right in the weeds. But he had an incredible temperament as a leader, and he could bring people along with him. And that's why I think in the surveys of presidents, I think he's really high up. He's like fourth or fifth, obviously after Lincoln and Washington and those sorts of people, but he's very high up. And that is really a testament to his temperament as a leader. And I think that's something which is often overlooked because the world we live in wants immediate answers. We've got to respond to the media 24/7. We've got to be seen that we're hyperactive almost. But actually, I think an ability to step a little bit back and consider your actions over a longer term, I think is something that's missing a lot in modern leadership.
I really agree with you in that judgment that temperament in leadership is an absolutely vital ingredient.
Absolutely vital.
And not panicking.
Yeah, that's right.
In my own experience, I've seen that happen so many times.
Yeah,
and,
one does.
People throw their toys out of the pram and
That's
just
right.
completely lose balance and judgment.
That's right. And I was looking at this, from not only my experiences, because I've worked with all the 5 prime ministers. I mean, David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris, Rishi, I worked with him very closely when he was Chancellor, and obviously Liz. And I think temperament is a big issue. I mean, I won't comment on their respective temperaments. But obviously that's it. And when you look at the past, you read about wartime scenarios, you read about all of these things and problems. I think the key to solving a lot of these problems is the right temperament.
And do you see enough politicians these days trying to bring the temperature down as opposed to ratcheting up?
I think it's really hard to do. Funny enough, I think Rishi Sunak has a good temperament, but he's got a host of other problems that, he has to deal with. I mean, notably the fact that we're at the end of, not the end, but we could be at the end of 14 years of Conservative rule. And as I say, 14 years is a very long time. But I think the way that modern politics and modern media is 24/7, 150 miles an hour, they're so fast-paced. What was relevant 2 days ago is not on the news anymore. And it's moving all the time, very quickly. And politicians have to react very quickly to the headline of the immediate minute, let alone the hour. I think all of these things make the kind of cool decision-making much harder, and the ability just to step back and try and work out what it is you're trying to do and convey that sense of calm. I think it's much harder for politicians to do that now than might have been the case, many years ago.
Quasi, if you look at the general situation in Europe and what's happening here in the UK, you could argue that, we're moving to the centre-left. Okay, that perhaps is a temporary phenomenon rather than a trend. But at the same time, if you look across the European political landscape, there's a very significant movement to the right. And okay, we have the seeds of a movement to the right in the UK as well with the Reform Party. How do you interpret those general political events? Because I think they are the framework within which we have to see, as it were, the future of the UK.
That's right. So the big issue, I think, as I look at Europe and I look at Maloney, her party sort of came from nowhere. They haven't been around very long. They have, but they haven't been in power.
And surprisingly successful. Maloney,
yes,
a lot of people predicted she'd be a disaster.
That's right. She was seen as a far-right, in inverted commas, candidate. And then, of course, once she got into power, she has essentially moderated or has projected herself in a more moderate way. And I've been in, frontline politics for many years now. And I had interactions with people in Germany, in Italy, in France, in America. And it's the same issues that are coming up. And what has fascinated me is that the centre-right parties, I remember going to France and you'd see the Sarkozys, Les Républicains, that's what they call themselves, and they imploded essentially. And they were outflanked by Le Pen. the centre-right of Italy, the Christian Democrats, no one talks about them anymore. And then there was Berlusconi's party, but that's now in the background. And Meloni, the Brothers of Italy, have essentially taken that ground. Even in America, I went to the Republican convention in 2008, which seems like a very long time ago. But and all the people I spoke to, and many of them are friends, some of them I'm still kept in touch with, were essentially centre-right, but, cool kind of Wall Street types, if you like, if you want to characterise them in that way. And they've been essentially eliminated by populists, the Trumpian movement. So you see all across Europe and the West generally, a lot of centre-right parties have essentially been superseded by more populist parties.
Why is that? Is that social media? Is that globalism, failures?
I think globalism and immigration, which obviously are linked, have led to a complete metamorphosis of the centre-right. And I've seen this happen over the last 6 or 7, 8 years. Trump stood when he announced his candidature in 2015, 9 years, let's say. And even in Holland, I visit Holland a lot. Geert Wilders was seen as a kind of right-wing figure that was never going to get anywhere near power. He topped his party was the first placed in the election. So when you look at this over all these different countries, you think, what the hell's going on? And I think that this question of immigration, of national identity, it sort of dovetails into the kind of anti-woke movement or all of this sort of thing. Cultural politics is a very strong current. And I think that one of the problems that the Conservative Party has had is that it needs to kind of coalesce the right, if you like. And that's one of the things that a lot of these centre-right parties, movements, whatever you want to call them, fail to do in other countries. And we're kind of shielded a bit by the first-past-the-post system. I have no doubt in a proportional system, my left-wing friends said, the Liberals and Labour will win forever. They won't. In a proportional system, I think you could find a party like Reform getting 25%. Quite easily, because the electorate isn't stupid. They know that if it's proportional, every vote counts. So in a way, the patterns we would see would be very different.
You mentioned a lot of these cultural issues, the war on woke. A lot of these talking points seem to be talking points that have been carried over from the United States. And we've seen Liz Truss being on that podcast with Steve Bannon, saying nothing when he said that Tommy Robinson was a hero.
It's difficult.
The Tory donor who made those comments about Diane Abbott. Yes, but you are actually the first senior Conservative
to say this is racist and sexist, yes.
Why did it take so long for your colleagues to use that word? Was that disheartening for you?
It was crazy, that response. He said something like, this makes me want to hate black women and I want
this
to
makes me hate all black women and she should be shot.
Yeah, to argue that wasn't racist or sexist seemed bizarre to me. And actually, you're right. I was on the TV programme, I think the BBC Politics, and I just called it for what it was. It seemed obvious to me. And then Kemi, I think a few hours later, and she was within the government, within the cabinet, said, no, this is crazy. How can you justify this? And then they scurried and they supported her.
But there was also something similar with the former Deputy Party Chairman, Lee Anderson, who made those comments about the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, and said that he had given the capital away to his mates, the Islamists. And there were so many interviews with senior Conservative officials who tried very hard to avoid using terms like racist and like Islamophobic. Why do you think that was?
So it's a very difficult issue. Funnily enough, with the Lee Anderson issue, I wouldn't have taken the whip away from him because, again, I think it's overreacting. Taking the whip away from somebody is a very serious act, and you can do it, if he'd said something really inflammatory, which I don't think those remarks quite were. If he'd said something about Muslims, all Muslims, do terrible things, that's clearly racist. That's clearly something that you could act on. He was making a specific comment about Sadiq Khan, and I think it was possible. Again, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but it was possible to say, look, we totally disagree with this. This is wrong, but we're not going to take the whip away. Opposition parties will always say, of course you've got to take the whip away. They will always put that pressure. But again, I think taking the whip away from somebody used to be, anyway, quite a serious step. So at the point...
To make those comments, which I don't know if you're saying that they weren't racist comments or they weren't Islamophobic. A lot of people do feel that they were, and...
I think there was...
in a big multicultural capital like London, to say something like that is going to be very inflammatory for a lot of Muslims who feel discriminated against already. And to see that from the top of the Conservative Party, that wasn't problematic enough to lose the whip over? The fact that he didn't really...
I think we've lost sight of what taking the whip away from someone... You don't take the whip away from someone just because they've made inflammatory and wicked comments.
Really?
No, I don't think you... I think it's more fundamental than that. I think if they vote against the government or if they are campaigning for other parties from within the party, it's quite a technical thing. If someone says something that is rude and I disagree with, or as a leader, I don't think that's grounds for taking the whip away from somebody. I mean, it was interesting. Admittedly, it happened a very long time ago, but when Enoch Powell made his inflammatory remarks, and they were racist, that was in 1968, Rivers of Blood, it's called. He was sacked from the shadow front bench. He was the defense secretary and he was kicked out of the shadow cabinet. The whip wasn't withdrawn even then. And I know it was a long time ago, but I think, it's a very big step to take the whip away from somebody for saying comments and not voting against the government and not acting consistently or over a long period of time. Generally, in the old days, people would have the whip removed because it was chronic, it was consistent behaviour over many, it wasn't just a comment. He'd always voted with the government. Anyway, I don't want to rehearse this, but I think the way in which we react, it was clearly a reactive step. I think that inflamed the situation because what Lee's doing now is essentially he's campaigning for the Reform Party against Conservatives.
Yeah, I mean, Reform looks as though it could sort of ruin...
I think they're a big problem.
The Conservatives' prospects at the next election. Because, they won't get many members themselves.
They won't get any seats.
No, exactly. Think. Well, they might get it, but one or two.
But what's what I was talking about in terms of, as I look, I've had a lot of time to think about and I go visit countries like France and Germany. And as I say, I think this is happening all over the Western world. You've got centre-right parties that are quite vulnerable to more right-wing parties, if you want to describe them in that way, on questions of identity, on immigration, and also other social issues. And I think the problem that Rishi Sunak faces is this insurgency on the reform on the right, if you want to call it that. And if you look at the numbers, when I left office, 2 weeks before Rishi became Prime Minister, I think reform were on about 4%, 3 or 4%.
18 now, aren't they?
They're way into double digits.
Yeah.
And that's why, we were in the kind of low 20s when I left office and when Liz Truss left office, and we're in the low 20s today. And the reason why we don't seem to have made any progress in those 18 months can be explained very considerably by this phenomenon, this reform.
You've got 2 elections coming up. You've got the local council elections, and then, of course, you've got the European elections. The European elections, the predictions seem to be that, for example, in France, the Rassemblement National, Le Pen, she might well be the largest French element in... Yeah.
That's pretty... I go to France quite a bit, and I know a couple of people who are, in the political system there. And, for them, it's very difficult to know how to deal with, the Assembly, the Rassemblement National. They were the old National Front, but they've rebranded themselves. And it's very difficult. They're going to get 30%. They're going to probably come top. And what do you do? Do you try and make accommodation with them? Do you try and fight them on their issues? It's very difficult. If you look at the Dutch elections, essentially the centre-right party tried to campaign on immigration like Geert Wilders. And all they did was help Geert Wilders because they're essentially talking about their issue. But at the same time, you can't just ignore the issue. So it's a very difficult thing to balance.
Is it a problem that for a lot of right-wing parties, for them immigration is a negative issue? It is something that has to be tackled. It's something that has to be clamped down. There is not really a positive case for immigration. There is not really anyone making the argument that in the years to come, we will need immigrants, we will need migrants. Look at yourself.
Sure,
your parents were immigrants, and look at the success story that you were.
I've got a lot to say about that. And this is where I am sympathetic to more conservative voices on this. And even Powell, funnily enough, said this in 68. It's about the numbers. It's about the scale. Okay. And if you look at our country, when my parents came, my mother came, I think, in 63, 60 years ago. But for about 50 years, from 1950 to 2000, the average net figure I think was 50,000. If I'm wrong, someone will correct me, but I think it was something like 50,000 a year. That caused some social anxiety, but essentially the country absorbed that. I think the point that people on the right are making about this is that the scale of the immigration. So I've said 50,000 a year for 50 years, and it sounds like a lot, but if in 1 year you've got 700,000, that's a totally different scale to the 50,000 net a year that we had between about 1950 and 2000. And that's what is driving a lot of this anxiety on more traditional right-wing facing, if you like, voters. And it has to be addressed as an issue, because if it isn't, you're simply just going to give more succor and more credence to a lot of people who are, for lots of bad reasons, malevolent reasons, willing to exploit the issue.
Right, but it's not like it was all halcyon when we had low levels of immigration. It was, and I'm sure that there are, as has happened to me, as has happened to lots of people of colour, questioning your Britishness because you are not Caucasian. It's not like that. And so the fact that there is a lot of xenophobia, and Lee Anderson's comments about our Mayor Sadiq Khan, taking the politics out of it, that kind of flavour to a lot of these discussions and othering of people. Aren't you concerned that is increasingly, and parties like Reform are almost goading traditional conservatives to match them in that kind of rhetoric?
But I think everything you say is right. But you can't simply ignore the issue. You can't simply say, well, 1 million people, let's say, have come talking about this is racist. I think that's really irresponsible. And that just actually, by not talking about it or by pretending that it's not an issue when people do feel it's an issue, I think you're just giving succor to actual proper extremists, who are racist, who want to sow division. But at the same time, you've got to be sensitive. You've got to mind your language, but you can't pretend that it's not an issue.
But if you compare us with France, it's a bigger issue in France.
Much bigger.
Much bigger. And I think in a way, if what you're saying is correct, that would explain why it's a worse problem in France politically than it is perhaps in the UK.
Fascination, and I love France, as many English people do, many British people do. And I think the issue with France is that a lot of the tension is around Islamism, political Islam, terrorism. We've seen all sorts of things. And how you integrate a large North African Islamic community into French society is a question which, many people think they haven't really addressed. And I think we've done probably a better job in integrating our immigrants. I'm always struck looking at, conservative cabinets, looking at conservative MPs. They're quite ethnically diverse. We haven't reached a nirvana.
It's much more diverse in the UK than it is in France. In France, it's very rare.
Way more. You look at a French cabinet, and they may have one or two people from an ethnic minority background.
They're probably Algerian.
Yeah, they could be. or and there might be one, a Senegalese woman or somebody, almost like a token. And they're very able people. But, the way you look at their cabinet, they're completely different to British cabinets, where you've got a whole host of people who've held very senior positions from families that have come from outside of Europe.
Yeah, no, it's very striking, I think that.
So on that, I think that, I think the question of Islam, given also what's going on in Gaza, I think that has a whole host of other questions.
There's always a friction between spending to invest and trying to balance the books, as it were, and cutting spending to be responsible for future generations. And this is a tension and an argument that is happening all around the world, not just in the UK. But we are likely to see more destabilising events in the future, not less. We're likely to see another pandemic, more wars, maybe even, putting economies on war economies, lots of that sort of thing. What do you think is the right path, in your opinion?
So I think that, and Richard, I'm sure, is better qualified than I to speak on this, but clearly with more geopolitical risk, you've got to spend proportionately more on defence. And I think both Keir Starmer and Grant Shapps and Rishi Sunak have essentially committed to that. They're saying we should spend 2.5% of GDP.
2.5% of
That's
GDP,
right.
yeah.
And I think that's the case around the Western world. We feel that it's a more dangerous world. There are more risks out there. and we've got to make sure that we can defend ourselves properly against those risks. So that seems to be something that's generally agreed upon. I think in terms of public expenditure, I think we haven't really had a debate about that, because unless you get, as I've said at the beginning, unless you get commensurately large growth, you're not going to be able to pay for the public services you want. But I think it's a very tricky thing because, take, for example, the triple lock on pensions. We're still committed to that. The Prime Minister, the Chancellor, they've said that they're committed to that, even though it is quite a costly commitment.
Does it need to go?
I think everything needs to be questioned, but that's my own private view. But I understand, having been, in a senior cabinet position, politically it's very difficult to do that. And you're not going to have this debate 6 months before a general election. But I'm sure whoever wins, whether Rachel Reeves is at the Treasury or Jeremy Hunt or another Conservative, whoever the Chancellor is, and particularly the Prime Minister, I'm sure they'll have a discussion about this.
Can I ask a follow-up question, which is closely related in terms of economic policy? It seems to me at the moment that the sort of risk environment, I guess as a hangover from 2008, is very much risk averse. I mean, the regulatory regime, of which I have a fair amount of personal experience because I have, jobs I do in the city, it is so controlling.
That's right.
And it seems to me that this is holding the economy back at the moment.
You're right. I think you're right. And I think that was one of the things that I was focused on, obviously, in my short period as Chancellor. And I think Jeremy Hunt, he talked about the Edinburgh reforms. But to what extent those so-called Edinburgh reforms will change the situation, I don't know. But you're quite right. I mean, I speak to friends of the city, the city, and they are always coming up against this regulation.
Yeah, I mean, if you take the AIM exchange, I mean, the valuation of companies now is rock bottom because the regulatory process you have to go through to register on AIM is just unbelievable. I mean, it's so heavy.
Yeah,
and it's easier to go back and be a private company.
Exactly. And they don't have as much regulatory burden. Yeah. They don't have to pay for, teams of compliance people and all the rest of it. And I think it's a big problem. So the regulatory side, given my provenance, given what I've done, I think the tax side is also an issue in terms of attracting people, in terms of, allowing companies to succeed and thrive. And I think that mixture, that context, makes economic growth very difficult. And going back to the mini budget as was, I think the thinking behind that, such as one can call it that, was very much a frustration at the fact that things were holding the British economy back. And I'm sure that Rachel Reeves or whoever the Chancellor of the Exchequer is after the election will be looking very closely at how we can grow the economy.
Does it stick in your craw, that phrase, Quasi, and the fact that, Keir Starmer, that you're a butt of his jokes? And do you feel that you were unfairly sort of blamed for that? No one talks about the cluster Truss budget,
I think
they
took a lot of. I don't want to feel sorry for myself. I don't think very many people think it was my budget and had nothing to do with her. So let me be fair. The name thing is a bit silly. Quasi, it's a silly pun, and I am associated with it, and I accept some responsibility for it. But I was not the Prime Minister. I was not the person who essentially campaigned on that particular issue. But as I think as time passes, a lot more people try and are understanding what we try to do. So I'm not living in the past on that. I mean, you can feel indignant, you can feel that things were unfair, but actually you've got to move on and look to the future and learn from the past. That's the most important thing. You need to be able to learn from those experiences. A few jokes here and there, the circumstances of it. I mean, I think that those are just the perils of a high-profile position.
Gosh, it's almost like you have that ideal temperament suited for politics, as you mentioned.
Well, I've learned it. I mean, it wasn't something as dramatic and it was a raw experience, having been in that environment. And my wife said to me, "You've been on the front page of every newspaper for the last 2 weeks." It's quite an intense experience.
How was that for your family?
I think it was okay. They were kind of shielded from it a little bit. And also my baby daughter, I mean, she won't know. She doesn't know about any of that now. But I think that once you go through a period like that, I think you've got to reflect and try and understand, what your own failings were, the things that you couldn't control, how you might have done things differently. and what the big lessons are. And that was why I go on about this temperament thing, because I think if you'd asked me 3 years ago, I probably would have said, you need experience, you need knowledge, you need brains, you need all this information, all of that sort of stuff. But actually, when things are so intense and you're being assailed all the time, I think that ability just to have a clear mind.
We all learn from crises.
That's right. I mean, you put it beautifully. We all learn from that.
I mean, 9/11 was a pretty searing experience for those of us directly involved, as was all the things that happened subsequently.
Yeah, and also intelligence failures.
And you feel much better equipped to make decisions after you've been through these really difficult experiences.
That's exactly right. I think Richard's 100% right, and has put it much more crisply than I can. But that's right. The thing is to learn and grow. And I think that's very important from that point of view.
What do you make of Rachel Reeves? What advice would you give her if she were to become the next
Again,
Chancellor?
temperament. I think if they do get in, I don't know, a lot of it will depend on the majority, if they have one. But, she will have, one expects, at least 3 or 4 years where she can be responsible with Keir Starmer for the economy. And my understanding is that in terms of that relationship, she is very much the economy person, whereas Keir, interested though he might be, is less involved. And I think what she will, I'm sure, have learned from our experience, my experience, is that there's no point trying to change everything on the first day. Looking back, that was very much my view, I think, at the time. But I think you've got time. I remember at one point, and I talked about this, the Prime Minister said, I've only got 2 years. And I said, you'll have 2 months if you carry on like this. 2 years is actually quite a long time. I mean, God knows.
In these days, it is.
Yeah, it's a long time. It's not the blink of an eye. Yeah. You can do a lot in 2 years. But I think you've got to, as Her Majesty said, pace yourself. You can't simply try and sprint your way around a marathon.
A brief question. I mean, it's a big question, but, for a brief answer, I'm sure you can manage. The global economic environment. We've got a US government, which you could argue is furiously overspending and heading into massive debt, despite growth figures in the United States. You've got a Chinese economy, which is claiming 5% growth.
It's a black box for all we know.
Sorry?
It's a black box for all we know,
Yeah, but I mean, which is almost certainly not the case.
That's right.
So you've got China facing economic difficulties. You've got the insecurity, created by 2 significant wars happening simultaneously. And, we're out of Europe standing to the side. I mean, what would be your brief summary of this rather challenging global framework?
You're quite right. I think there's a huge amount of uncertainty, clearly. Yeah. I think one of the saving graces, and it sounds paradoxical, is that because interest rates have risen, you do actually have a monetary policy response, which is to lower interest rates. Yeah. Whereas the problem we had, relatively recently was that because interest rates were so low,
you couldn't do anything.
You couldn't do any in a crisis where you would want to, loosen money. You couldn't do that. But of course, now they're at a reasonable rate. They're sort of 4-5%, 5.25 in the UK. I think that gives the bankers, the monetary policy people, some ammunition.
Levers, yeah.
But I think the biggest threat is this geopolitical uncertainty. I mean, the Hamas invasion, which is what it was on October the 7th, none of us knew about that. I think even the Israelis didn't know about that. And they had the most interest to know about those things. And I think given that experience, there are other things that, I think, what did Rumsfeld call them? Unknown unknowns. It's that world of things that could just come out of nowhere.
Venezuela claiming a big chunk
all of this stuff. Venezuela. It's very unclear what China are doing with Taiwan. I mean, people say they won't necessarily invade it, but that's something that could happen. And I think the other thing the most uncertain thing, if you talk to any people in business and politics, one of them, is the whole Trump question. Is he going to come back?
Is he going to come back? But at least he agreed to 60 billion.
Yes, he did.
For Ukraine, which is a big event.
That was a big event.
Yeah,
I was very surprised, actually, that happened. And I was speaking to Republican people just last week, and they were saying, why are we spending this money there? The Ukrainian government is not our friend, all of this stuff. And then I was very surprised that the speaker showed pragmatism enough and decency, in my view, enough to support Ukraine, because I think that's critically important.
Yeah.
That's it for this week's episode of One Decision. We drop new episodes every Thursday. Like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Drop us a line. Tell us your thoughts. What decisions have impacted you and where you live? You can write to us. Our email is onedecision@onedecisionpodcast.com. From me and the team, thank you for listening and see you next time.